All right, let's talk about getting insulted. You've had it happen. I've had it happen. Some insults are not terribly well crafted. They're dumb. They miss the point entirely. It's pretty easy to let that take a deflecting angle and bounce off with no damage done. Maybe if I am a little worn down on other stuff, I'll catch a stray from time to time where the merit of the insult or the construction of the insult isn't real good, but I'm just vulnerable right now and it hits a little harder. Maybe you're like me on that. Maybe you're not. But certainly, I think most of us would admit that a very well-crafted, well-targeted insult from a talented person who feels as though they can look deep into my soul and know exactly what the vulnerable part is, those sting. Those can bring weird things out of us, and you kind of learn something about somebody when you see what they do in the face of a good old-fashioned insult. And likewise, today in Nehemiah chapter 4, we're going to learn a thing or two about Nehemiah and his buddies, because they just took a variety of insults from across the insult spectrum. Some of the insults are very good. Some of the insults, I'm not sure I totally understand why it's an insult. One of the insults is, as we discussed yesterday, embarrassingly poorly formed, and I think pretty easy to shrug off. But when we evaluate ourselves, I think we tend to imagine ourselves under not duress and think about how we perform socially and emotionally in the face of middling pressure. Well, getting heckled and yelled at, threatened, insulted, that can take us to some really different places and test our mettle. Let's see what kind of metal Nehemiah is made of. All right, here are the insults. When Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, we read this yesterday, I'm reading it again, he became angry and he was greatly incensed. He ridiculed the Jews, and in the presence of his associates and the army of Samaria, he said, insult number 1, "What are those feeble Jews doing?" All right, is that a good insult or is that a bad insult? You know what? It's not quite 8th grade bully level insult, because I tell you what, I don't think I ever met a higher concentration of people at any point in my life who could look deep into my soul and find every exploitable vulnerability and cook up a perfectly crafted, clever insult to exploit exactly what the vulnerability or insecurity was than I did my 8th grade year. Those kids, they were just fantastic. So gifted at making people feel horrible. Probably I'm one of the people who, when they think back to their 8th grade year, they're like, no, I picture that guy. He did it to me. Maybe we all did it to each other. I don't know. Maybe we were all just really sensitive. But this does not rise to the level, for me, of a quality 8th grade withering insult. But it's not a totally impotent insult, because the Jews have had some trouble with getting things built. You know, since the Persians came along, it took them a real long time to get the temple done. There was resistance. They folded in the face of that resistance, could have knocked it out in maybe just a couple of years. Instead, it took more than a generation to get that done, and it took the full blessing of 2 separate regimes and their money to get it done. Man, everything was working in your favor, and it was still really hard for you to do it. Maybe that's still a sore spot, so maybe that insult hits a little bit close to home here and would trigger Nehemiah a little bit. Also, it's been a long time at this point. We're talking about 60, 70, almost 80 years, maybe north of 80 years, about 80 years since that accomplishment was achieved. What have they built since then? Paneled houses in the Persian style for themselves. They haven't really been able to come together and make anything awesome or lasting since then. So it doesn't sound like much of an insult. What are those feeble Jews doing? But, yeah, I mean, you know, there's a narrative there. That it could bring out something negative. Let's see what else we got from Sanballat. The next insult. Will they offer sacrifices? Okay, that could still be interpreted as a dig at their inability to get walls and a roof put around the altar where they showed up in 538 BC after Cyrus let them go back. And they're like, we're going to offer sacrifices right now. And it took a real long time to enclose that space. But, you know, maybe it's a dig at that as well. Let's see what other insults we got here. Will they finish in a day? I guess I don't really get that one. Is that a veiled threat or something? Like, unless you get those walls built today, we're going to mess with you. Could be that. Sort of turns out that way. But that one's not quite as sharp. Can they bring the stones back to life from those heaps of rubble, burned as they are? We're going to come back to that phrase later on. But for now, that's the insult. okay, yeah, I guess I sort of see it. The idea that you're a dead, old, tired people group. You got whipped by the Assyrians. You got whipped by the Babylonians. Now you're the stool pigeons for the Persians. Y'all are hanging on by a thread, and maybe in this metaphor, it's kind of like you all are the dead stones. The stones, they're dead in the first place, and they just kind of stay dead. It's not coming back to life. Okay, I suppose I see what he's trying to strike at. I suppose I see what he's grumbling about. Probably behind all of that, there's some imagined sense that he is a great builder, that his family are great builders. They're the makers of things. And so there's probably some elbows in the ribs, like, right? Am I right? Like, we're really good, and those guys are not good at things. But on the whole, I'm going to give it a 4.5 out of 10 in terms of quality of insult if you're throwing this at me. If you're throwing this at Nehemiah and the Jews at that time, I'm going to go like a 6, maybe 6.5. But then you get this horrible insult at the end that we laughed about yesterday from Tobiah the Ammonite, who hears this big, long reeling off of things from Sanballat. It's like, yeah, hold on, I got one too. It's also like if you're... Everybody's looking at him. It's like it's if a fox goes up there, that wall's probably going to fall over, right, guys? It's a terrible wall. Foxes are not that heavy. Even a fox would knock it over. You guys get it? Because so the walls are supposed to stop armies, and they are big, and they're trying to knock it down, whereas a fox is small and lightweight. It's not even trying to knock down the wall. What I am saying is that their wall is so bad that even a little tiny animal it seems like you guys get it. Nobody's laughing. I thought it was pretty good. That's not a great insult and was pretty weak, but we're still going to learn things about Nehemiah based on how he responds to that, because even a bad insult can tell us things about a person. Here's what we get from Nehemiah. Nehemiah 4:4. Hear us, O our God, for we are despised. Turn their insults back on their own heads. Give them over as plunder in a land of captivity. Do not cover up their guilt or blot out their sins from your sight, for they have thrown insults in the face of the builders. So we rebuilt the wall till all of it reached half its height, for the people worked with all their heart. Now, I am interpreting those verses that I just read you, even though I don't think they really have quotation marks around them, as being somehow representative of a prayer or a declaration on the part of Nehemiah, maybe a corporate declaration amongst all the workers on the walls. You can almost imagine them singing in a Disney build montage as they slap mortar and brick together, and make those lines rhyme somehow, and it could be something that's like a motivational statement of intent that they're all on the same page. However exactly you interpret it, I think we learn good things about them in terms of how they respond to these insults. One, they are socially attentive. They know what Sanballat and Tobiah and their buddies are over there jeering about. They are attentive enough to know they're being insulted. They're attentive enough to understand the attempt to construct an insult. And they know that it betrays their intent to be more disruptive than just jeering and complaining. So they know to take the insult seriously. I mean, what's the rule of life, right? If somebody tells you who they are and what they're going to do repeatedly, even if it sounds wild and deranged and far-fetched, at some point you might want to believe them for your own good. Well, one thing we learn about Nehemiah in the face of insults is that he knew when to take it seriously, and he's vindicated in that. This turns out to be a threat. We also learn that where Nehemiah goes when he is under threat is to God, that he believes he's doing something God wants him to do, that he is on a mission that matters and is right and that must be completed even in the face of pressure. So rather than blustering back, he goes right to God, just as he did last time around in the face of the insulting accusation that they got from Sanballat at the end of chapter 2. And he was like, wow, what is this you're doing? Are you rebelling against the king? How does Nehemiah respond to that insult? Same way, right to God. The God of heaven will give us success. We, his servants, will start rebuilding. But as for you, you have no share in Jerusalem or any claim or historic right to it. Nehemiah has got a clear anchor point. He's got something he goes back to every time. Kind of like Jesus. What did he do every time he was under pressure? Well, he went to his father. He depended on his father. That was the relationship that sustained him, that nourished him, even somehow in a literal sense, when he was out in the desert for all of that time. And so Nehemiah, he's doing the same thing, right back to God, right back to God. And also he's going to take a page out of the playbook of the psalmists, and he's going to pray for God to handle the business so that he doesn't have to and he can just keep building the wall. Turn their insults back on their own heads. Give them over as plunder in a land of captivity. Okay, well, that tells me something right there, that he did read their remarks as a mockery that they were taken away into captivity and that somehow they're better because they were not taken away in captivity. They were a part of probably some sort of Assyrian resettlement program that partly included some of the hill people left behind after the Assyrian conquest in 722 BC, as well as some people who were repatriated or moved from somewhere in Babylon to go and mingle these people groups. So there was some smugness that I think Sanballat was intoning and that Nehemiah was picking up in those insults, and that comes through in the fact that Nehemiah is praying to God that there will be this kind of justice. Give them over as plunder in a land of captivity. Do not cover up their guilt or blot out their sins from your sight, for they have thrown insults in the face of the builders. And that prayer in an Old Testament sense is absolutely in keeping with the deal that God has made with his chosen people and the way that God has used the nations both to punish his own people, but never is to be interpreted as God saying, everything they're doing is great. Those foreign nations that don't worship me or acknowledge me at all and do these horrible things, I like all that stuff now. No, the correct way to understand it, and he's even very explicit about this in talking with the prophet Habakkuk, is no, there'll be justice for them as well, and that's up to God to decide because he's writing his judgments, and I don't know what the heck I'm doing, so I'm happy to defer on that. And apparently Nehemiah was as well, by simply handing over all of the mental pressure, emotional pressure that comes with having an enemy standing right there mocking you. Just hand that over to God and be like, cool, you do as you see fit. You are God. You know what to do. You know how to handle these things. I will pray for justice, and you will do with that, God, whatever you need to do with that in your wisdom. So we rebuilt the wall till all of it reached half its height, for the people worked with all their heart. There is a further take on what Nehemiah and these people are doing in response to insults, which is work harder, dig deeper, be more committed to the thing. If Sanballat and Tobiah are mad about this and they're throwing out impotent barbs from a distance, cool, we're probably on the right track here. Let's keep going. I've told you before that I really like Nehemiah. He's one of my favorite characters in the Bible. I don't think he's perfect. I don't think he always knows what to do, but I love the way he saw a problem, made the problem his, is blowing past all of the insults and opposition and criticism and mean comments and just getting the thing done. And isn't it something how petty and meaningless those insults feel to us when we're not part of it and we're not on the receiving end? It's actually kind of easy for me to read this and think, well, obviously just power through that. It's no big deal. But it's not so easy when people are yelling insults at you. And it was Mike Tyson's famous quote, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. Everybody thinks insults are easy to deal with and roll with until they're all directed at you. This was a real pressure in a really, truly difficult time, and Nehemiah handled it with class. Of course he was irritated. Of course he wanted all of this to boomerang around on them, and he was content to hand that off to God and let that be up to him. May we pass the test as well, my friends, when you and I are confronted with insults and mean things getting said about us. All right, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour Podcast. Let's do this again soon.